Hello, my friends. The so-called holiday slowdown in politics is a comforting myth. Western capitals repeat to themselves because it suggests the world can be paused like a streaming show, while elites go home and pretend history can be rescheduled. That illusion collapses in Ukraine. War does not take Christmas off. Logistics do not pause. Casualties do not wait for public relations calendars. And most importantly, the strategic balance does not freeze simply because Western bureaucracies want it to. What we are watching right now is not just a battlefield contest. It is a collision between two incompatible realities. Russia's insistence on strategic outcomes it considers existential, and the West's refusal, especially Europe's refusal, to accept that it has lost the initiative, lost escalation dominance, and lost the ability to dictate the terms of settlement. In that context, the recent trip by Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, to Florida, where he met with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, should be understood as a reconnaissance mission, not a peace mission. Dmitriev described the meetings as constructive. That word is intentionally bland. It does not signal a breakthrough. It does not signal concessions. It signals that the conversation happened, that both sides remain courteous, and that Russia likely used the opportunity to probe American thinking and clarify what Washington believes it can realistically offer. Western online commentary has predictably turned Dmitriev into a character in a conspiracy novel. Some insist he is a loose cannon, operating outside Kremlin control, forming personal relationships with U.S. power brokers and freelancing peace deals. This is fantasy, and it reflects how the West projects its own dysfunctional political habits onto Russia. In Moscow's system, especially in wartime, people do not freelance on matters of war and peace. Dmitriev is not an independent actor. If he was in Florida, he was there with approval, with boundaries, and with explicit objectives. He is the kind of figure Russia uses when it wants communication without illusion. Someone fluent in Western language, culture, and negotiation style, but still operating under state discipline. And in Russia, that discipline ultimately flows upward to the Security Council and to Putin. The purpose of Dmitriev's Florida meetings is almost certainly to gather intelligence on the diplomatic maneuvering that occurred in Berlin between Americans, Europeans, and Ukrainians, and to transmit Russian reactions back through official channels. That is what constructive likely means. A structured exchange, not an agreement. Now, Dmitriev's biography is often presented in the West as proof of ideological softness, Ivy League education, fluent English, business background. But the more important fact is how he is perceived within Russia's own political ecosystem. People who know Russia's internal debates understand that Dmitriev has been associated with efforts to rebuild domestic industrial capacity, manufacturing, technology, import substitution, precisely the agenda that became essential after Western sanctions. In other words, if anything, his career aligns with Russia's pursuit of sovereignty from Western economic leverage. Much more revealing than Dmitriev, however, are comments by Yuri Ushakov, a senior Kremlin official far closer to Putin and far more directly tied to Russia's strategic decision-making. Ushakov essentially poured cold water on the whole Berlin process. He said he had not even seen a text produced by the Berlin discussions and did not expect anything good to come from it. That is not casual pessimism. It is a signal that Moscow does not recognize Berlin as a serious track and does not intend to let European demands define the terms of negotiation. This is consistent with what has been obvious for months. Russia is not bargaining from a position of weakness. Russia is bargaining when it bargains at all from strength, and it is perfectly comfortable letting time do more work on its behalf. Putin's speeches and public posture reinforce this. He is not talking like a man scrambling for an exit. He is talking like a leader who believes his strategic direction is validated by battlefield dynamics, by economic resilience, and by the cohesion of Russia's internal elite. When you hear confident statements from the Kremlin, You should not dismiss them as propaganda by default. You should evaluate whether the objective conditions match the confidence. Right now, they do. On the military front, Russia continues to advance, not in dramatic Hollywood leaps, but in the way wars are actually won. Pressure, attrition, grinding forward movement, and systematic degradation of the enemy's capacity to respond. Russia's approach is not shock and awe. It is exhaustion and inevitability. On the economic front, Elvira Nabiullina has outlined a picture of stability, falling inflation, high investment levels, even if growth has deliberately slowed, expanding services, and growing manufacturing output. This matters because the Western strategy rested on the assumption that Russia would collapse under sanctions, social unrest, and financial isolation. That collapse did not happen. And now Russia operates with something the West does not want to admit: strategic patience. Slowing GDP growth to around 1% this year after stronger growth in previous years can be a deliberate policy tool. A central bank can tighten, slow demand, cool inflation, and stabilize currency conditions. If inflation falls and investment remains high, a slowdown can be an engineered adjustment, not a failure. Russia is signaling that it still has macroeconomic control in wartime. That is not a minor detail. It affects everything: recruitment, social stability, industrial production, and long-term endurance. Putin also benefits from what the West has, gradually but reluctantly, discovered. Russia's major partners, China and India, have not abandoned Moscow. They have adapted around sanctions, built parallel trade channels, and continued cooperation. This removes the leverage the West assumed it possessed. When your opponent has alternative markets, alternative payment systems, and alternative suppliers, isolation becomes a slogan rather than a strategy. That context explains why Russia is in no mood to make concessions. Concessions are made when you fear collapse, when you need relief, or when the battlefield forces you to trade territory for time. Russia does not face those conditions. Moscow also understands domestic politics. Major concessions would be unacceptable to the Security Council, unacceptable to key institutional factions, and unacceptable to a population that has been told correctly, from its perspective, that this conflict is about Russia's security architecture, not charity for Ukraine. Now shift to the other side. Zelensky continues to present maximal demands while occupying a collapsing strategic position. He insists Ukraine will not withdraw from Donbass, Zaporizhia, or Kherson. He insists on a ceasefire along current lines, but not as a settlement, rather as a pause for rearmament. He wants a larger Ukrainian force post-ceasefire, modernized at Western expense, with U.S. security guarantees ratified by the Senate and comparable in effect to NATO's Article 5, while NATO membership remains postponed but not abandoned. That package is not a peace proposal. It is a demand that Russia accept a future war on worse terms. It asks Moscow to stop winning today so Ukraine can be stronger tomorrow. No rational Russian government would sign that. Western media sometimes sells this as Zelensky has moderated. He has not. He was pushed into accepting a ceasefire concept only when the United States applied pressure, briefly withholding intelligence support. But after that forced adjustment, he has refused any additional concessions. His posture remains freeze and rearm approach. So we have the core deadlock. Russia believes it is winning and has no incentive to trade away its advantage. Ukraine is losing and should logically seek settlement, but politically cannot admit defeat, and therefore clings to demands that are strategically impossible. And Europe is the accelerant. Europe's leadership, especially Britain and the most hawkish EU factions, remain committed to the narrative that Russia must be stopped at all costs, because admitting failure would collapse their entire post-2022 political mythology. They also fear the domestic consequences: elections, legitimacy crises, and accountability for energy policy disasters, inflation, and deindustrialization. This is where the Reuters episode becomes revealing. Reuters cited anonymous sources familiar with U.S. intelligence, claiming Putin still intends to capture all Ukraine and even reclaim parts of Europe. That is the classic template. Anonymous intelligence claims used to justify policy escalation. But then Tulsi Gabbard, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, issued a sharp public denial, saying no such assessment exists and accusing warmongers of undermining Trump's peace efforts. Elon Musk echoed her stance. Whether the Reuters claim was fabricated or simply laundered European assumptions packaged as U.S. intelligence, the deeper truth is that Europe's conventional wisdom remains maximalist. Russia is portrayed as inherently expansionist. Negotiations are treated as appeasement, and any compromise is framed as a moral collapse. Yet the historical record undermines Europe's rhetoric. In early 2022, negotiations did occur. Contacts began immediately after the start of the operation. Talks progressed toward draft frameworks often associated with Istanbul that do not resemble a plan to annex all of Ukraine. Those facts do not fit the European narrative, so they are erased, minimized, or reframed as Russian deception. Diddices. But even if you assume Russia used diplomacy tactically, so what? Every state uses diplomacy tactically. The point is that Europe's public storyline, Russia always wanted all of Ukraine, functions mainly as a political instrument to prevent settlement and justify continued war spending. Meanwhile, Europe is reaching limits. The EU's proposed 90 billion loan is not enough to cover Ukraine's 2026 needs. Even that package is financially messy. It is unclear how it will be raised, what instruments will be used, how unified EU members actually are behind it, and what downstream stress it will impose on already strained European economies. Europe can posture about infinite support, but budgets are not slogans. Now, while diplomacy stalls and Europe performs ideological theater, battlefield realities keep changing. In the Odessa region, Russia has intensified drone and missile strikes against bridges and key logistics points in the southwestern sector. There are two plausible interpretations, and both hurt Ukraine. The first is logistics interdiction. Ukraine's fuel and oil products, lacking domestic refinery capacity, depend heavily on imports from the West. If a major portion of those imports moves through this corridor by road and rail across bridges, then systematic strikes can degrade fuel flow, raising costs and reducing the Ukrainian army's mobility. You do not need a complete cutoff to create crisis. A partial disruption at scale is enough to slow troop movements, complicate resupply, and force triage decisions at the front. The second interpretation is operational preparation. Sustained strikes may be softening the region in advance of a larger maneuver, possibly amphibious or multi-directional, aimed at strategic encirclement or the creation of pressure points around Odessa. Historical analogies like the pre-Normandy interdiction campaign should be used carefully because technology and doctrine have changed, but the logic of shaping operations remains. You cut supply, isolate areas, blind defenses, and then you strike where the enemy cannot respond quickly. In Zaporizhia, Russian advances around Hulai-Pol are notable. Reports suggest fighting has moved into deeper sections of the town, possibly toward its western outskirts. Ukrainian footage of defensive lines, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, and trench-like features may look impressive on drone video, but fortification quality is not just about visible obstacles. It is about depth, integration, minefields, fire lanes, and the ability to reinforce under bombardment. Russia's defense architecture in 2023, the so-called Surovikin line, was effective because it combined depth, minefields, anti-armor obstacles, ditches, and kill zones. A shallow wall of obstacles can be breached, especially when your opponent has air power and heavy bomb capability designed to smash fortifications. Civilian engineering firms can build structures that look neat and symmetrical. Military engineers build structures designed to kill attackers and channel them into annihilation zones. If Ukraine relied excessively on civilian methods, it may have produced defenses that photograph well but fail under pressure. Elsewhere, Russia continues to consolidate positions that Ukraine claimed to have retaken. Control of villages like Ivankiv near Novopavlivka, being universally acknowledged as Russian-held, suggests either Ukrainian counterattacks failed or they never truly succeeded and were inflated for morale and PR. This pattern repeats often. Grand announcements, followed by silence, followed by a quiet return to Russian control. In the Pokrovsk-Myrnihard sector, Russia's capture claims such as Svitloyarsky add up to a steady tightening of the noose. Even Ukrainian mapping initiatives now show much of Myrnihard in contested gray zones. That alone is significant, because gray zones on maps usually mean defenders no longer have stable, uncontested control. They are bleeding out. In Kupiansk and along the Oskil River, Russia claims thousands of Ukrainian troops are isolated on the east bank. Ukraine insists it is making progress. Here, one must judge by past accuracy patterns. Russian reporting on encirclement dynamics has often proven more reliable than Ukrainian claims of breakthroughs. That is not to say Russia never exaggerates, but the burden of proof lies with whoever keeps announcing victories that never translate into stable territory control. The most strategically sensitive development may be in Sumy region. Russia appears to have resumed offensive operations with intensity, crossing the border at different points, capturing villages, and forcing evacuations. This likely reflects Ukrainian redeployments, troops pulled from the north to stabilize crises around Donbass, Pokrovsk, and other hotspots. Russia is exploiting that. Sumy matters because of geography and political psychology. If Sumy city were threatened or fell, Russia would have access to a major road corridor leading toward Kyiv. Even if Ukraine could fortify along the route, Russia's ability to advance on a strong road network changes the operational equation. Zelensky is famously sensitive to threats to Kyiv. Therefore, if Russia builds pressure in Sumy, Kyiv will likely siphon resources from other fronts to prevent a direct northern crisis, even if that weakens Donbass further. That is how multi-front pressure wins wars. You force the enemy to choose where to lose. Now add the maritime layer. Western states are escalating interference with Russian oil, shipping boarding tankers, investigating under pretexts like weapons transport, and applying pressure through insurance and seaworthiness rules. This is, in practice, coercion at sea. Russia is responding in predictable ways, reflagging vessels to Russian registry and increasing naval protection. This is where Western policymakers play with fire. Boarding a stateless or heavily sanctioned tanker of a weak country is one thing. Boarding or threatening Russian-flagged vessels under Russian naval coverage is another. The risk of confrontation rises sharply when a state has both capability and willingness to respond militarily. Reports suggest some Western governments recognize this danger. It becomes a maritime game of chicken. Europe may talk itself into believing Russia will not escalate at sea, but Russia has already signaled it will protect its commercial lifelines. Moreover, other major trading states, especially China, could decide to play similar games, offering flags, escorts, or alternative mechanisms to shield energy trade. China's fleet size and strategic posture alone complicate Western assumptions about naval dominance. So where does this leave us? Diplomacy is stuck because the West is demanding outcomes Russia will never accept, and Russia is pursuing a battlefield-driven settlement that the West cannot politically tolerate. Ukraine lacks power to shape the settlement but refuses to recognize that fact. Europe continues to act as if moral fervor can substitute for industrial capacity and budget stability. The United States is divided internally between those seeking an off-ramp and those determined to prolong confrontation. But the battlefield does not care about Western press releases. It cares about ammunition, manpower, fuel, rail nodes, bridges, drones, air power, and the relentless mathematics of attrition. Russia is advancing incrementally, methodically, while degrading Ukraine's ability to sustain the fight. The longer this continues, the weaker Ukraine becomes, the more exhausted Europe becomes, and the narrower the negotiating space becomes. That is the brutal logic of war. And it is why Russia, operating from a position of advantage, will not rush toward a deal that freezes the conflict on terms favorable to rearmament and a future NATO alignment. Moscow has seen that movie before. The question is not whether the West can keep repeating its narratives. It can. The question is whether the West can keep funding and sustaining a war whose strategic trend line runs against it. And if Europe reaches its financial ceiling as it appears to be approaching, then Ukraine's posture will be exposed for what it is, a maximalist wish list with no material foundation. As things stand, there is no genuine progress in diplomacy. The only progress is on the front lines. And day by day, that progress continues to belong to Russia. What ultimately defines this war is not rhetoric, not summits, not carefully staged photo opportunities in European capitals, and not the endless recycling of moral language designed to obscure material reality. Wars are decided by endurance, by industrial capacity, by command coherence, by logistics, and by the ability to impose one's will over time. On every one of those axes, Russia now holds the advantage. The West still speaks as if narrative control can substitute for power. It cannot. Europe continues to act as though repeating the same assumptions. Russia must lose, Ukraine must win, escalation will somehow remain controlled, will eventually make them true. But repetition is not strategy, and belief is not leverage. What Europe has demonstrated instead is rigidity without capacity, an ideological commitment to outcomes it no longer possesses the means to enforce. Ukraine tragically sits at the center of this contradiction. It is expected to fight indefinitely, to absorb losses indefinitely, to mobilize resources it does not have, all while being denied the one thing that might actually end the war on survivable terms: the freedom to negotiate based on reality rather than symbolism. Kyiv does not control the escalation ladder. It does not control the flow of weapons. It does not control the financial lifelines that keep the state functioning. And yet it is encouraged, sometimes pressured, to maintain maximalist demands as if sovereignty still translates into strategic autonomy. It does not. Russia, by contrast, has adapted. It has absorbed sanctions, rerouted trade, stabilized its economy, expanded domestic production, and restructured its military operations around attrition rather than spectacle. It has accepted that this war will not be decided quickly and has shaped its strategy accordingly. That is the difference between a state that plans to endure and a coalition that hopes events will turn in its favor before fatigue sets in. The battlefield trends are not ambiguous. Russian advances are not accidents. They are the result of sustained pressure applied across multiple axes, forcing Ukraine into constant reactive redeployments. Every time Kyiv stabilizes one front, another weakens. Every time Europe announces a new package, it arrives later, smaller, and more politically contested than the last. Every escalation at sea, every sanctions maneuver, every rhetorical hardening increases risk without changing the underlying balance. Diplomacy in this environment is frozen not because talks are impossible, but because the West is unwilling to accept what talks would actually require: acknowledgement of Russian gains, recognition of security realities, and abandonment of the fantasy that Ukraine can be transformed into a permanently armed forward base against Russia without provoking endless conflict. Moscow understands this. That is why it is not rushing. Time is working in its favor. The longer the war continues, the narrower the range of outcomes becomes. Windows that once existed for compromise close quietly, not with dramatic announcements, but with each village lost, each logistics hub destroyed, each cohort of trained troops exhausted. What remains at the end of such processes is not a grand diplomatic settlement, but a dictated reality formalized only after the facts on the ground have become irreversible. This is the uncomfortable truth that European leaders refuse to confront and that Ukrainian leaders cannot publicly acknowledge. The war is not stuck because Russia refuses peace. It is stuck because peace, as defined by the West, no longer corresponds to power. And history is unforgiving toward those who confuse aspiration with capability. In the end, wars do not conclude when one side grows tired of talking. They conclude when one side can no longer continue fighting on its own terms. That moment has not yet arrived, but the direction of travel is clear. Russia advances incrementally, methodically, without urgency, because it does not need urgency. Its opponent does, and that is the most decisive fact of all.